My mother-in-law said it the way other people announce the weather, flat, certain, already moving on to her next sentence before the first one had even finished landing. 40 relatives sat frozen around the rehearsal dinner table, forks halfway to their mouths, candlelight flickering over white linen and a 3-tier cake sample nobody would ever get to taste the real version of. My future mother-in-law, Eleanor Sinclair, remained standing at the head of the table, chin lifted, a woman who had spent 61 years never once doubting that a room would rearrange itself around whatever she decided was true. My fiancé, Ryan, sat beside me. He didn't move at first. He set his fork down slowly, the way you set something down when you need both hands free for what comes next, and I watched something shift behind his eyes that I had never seen there in 3 years together, not anger exactly, something colder and steadier than anger, the look of a man who had just finished waiting for a truth to arrive that he'd been expecting far longer than anyone in that room realized. There's been a misunderstanding, I said, which is what everyone says, which is exactly why nobody ever believes it when it's the truth. Eleanor didn't even look at me. There's no misunderstanding, Grace. I know exactly who you are. I've known for months. And that's when Ryan stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a folded manila envelope that had clearly been sitting there for longer than any of us knew, and set it on the table in front of his mother with the careful, deliberate motion of a man laying down a card he'd been holding for a very long time. Before you cancel anything, Mom, he said quietly, I think you should open that. Before I tell you what was inside that envelope, and trust me, what was inside that envelope is the part you are going to want to see. If you've ever had someone try to take away the one good thing in your life while smiling and calling it concern, hit that subscribe button right now. It costs you nothing, and for a small channel like Calm Stories Time, it means everything. Now let's go back 6 weeks, to the day my future mother-in-law decided she was going to stop this wedding no matter what it cost her. My name is Grace Lawson. I'm 31 years old, and for the last 7 years I've worked as a structural engineer. First for a mid-sized firm doing residential renovations and later, once I'd built a name for myself, as an independent consultant brought in on projects other engineers had already given up on. I specialize, if you can call it that, in finding the small structural failures other people miss, a hairline crack in a load-bearing wall, a foundation shifting half a degree in a direction nobody thought to measure. It's quiet work. It's careful work. And it had never, in 7 years, prepared me for the particular kind of demolition that was waiting for me inside my future mother-in-law's dining room. I met Ryan Sinclair at a conference 3 years ago, both of us standing awkwardly near the coffee station during a break in a session on commercial building codes neither of us had wanted to attend. He works in architecture, still does, and within 20 minutes of talking about cantilever loads and building envelopes, I understood 2 things clearly, that I was going to fall in love with this man, and that I was, without question, the least impressive thing his mother had ever encountered. Eleanor Sinclair came from money that had been in her family for 3 generations, the kind of quiet, old money that never announces itself loudly because it's never had to. She ran a family charitable foundation that her late husband had established, sat on the boards of 2 hospitals, and had, by every account I ever heard from Ryan's cousins, spent the last decade quietly steering her only son toward a woman named Vanessa Pierce, a family friend's daughter, a woman with the correct last name, the correct schools, the correct pedigree Eleanor had been assembling in her head since Ryan was still in diapers. I was not that woman. I grew up in a 2-bedroom rental outside Scranton with a single mother who worked double shifts at a hospital laundry facility to keep us fed, and I'd put myself through engineering school on loans I was still, 3 years into dating her son, quietly paying off every month. Eleanor never said any of this to my face directly. She was too careful, too practiced, too accustomed to delivering disapproval in the gentlest possible packaging. Instead, she said things like, "It's just refreshing to see Ryan with someone so grounded," in a tone that made the word grounded sound like something you'd scrape off the bottom of a shoe. Ryan proposed to me 14 months ago, on a bridge overlooking the river near where we'd had our first real conversation, and when I called my mother that night, sobbing into the phone from happiness, she asked me the one question I hadn't fully let myself think through yet. And what does his mother think? I didn't have a good answer. I still don't think I do. We set the wedding date for late spring, booked a venue an hour outside the city, a restored old estate with gardens Ryan and I had walked through together, laughing about nothing in particular. The first weekend we went to look at it. Eleanor offered, generously and immediately, to help cover a portion of the costs, an offer I now understand, looking back, was never really about generosity at all. It was about leverage. And I walked into that arrangement with my eyes half open, telling myself the woman who raised the man I loved couldn't possibly be working against us the entire time. If you've ever loved someone whose family made it very clear, in 100 small polite ways, that you weren't quite what they had planned for, you already know that particular kind of quiet exhaustion. Tell me in the comments if you've ever felt like you had to earn your place at a table that was never going to make room for you, and if this story already feels a little too familiar, go ahead and subscribe to Calm Stories Time now, because it only gets heavier from here. The first sign that something was genuinely wrong came about 6 weeks before the wedding, though at the time I mistook it for nothing more than one of Eleanor's usual small campaigns of subtle disapproval. Ryan and I had gone to his mother's house for what was supposed to be a routine Sunday dinner, the kind we'd been doing every few weeks since the engagement, mostly out of some unspoken hope on my part that enough proximity might eventually soften her. Ryan's aunt, a warm, slightly scattered woman named Diane who'd always been kind to me, pulled me aside in the kitchen while I was refilling a water pitcher. "I probably shouldn't say anything," she started, which is exactly the sentence that precedes every piece of information someone absolutely intends to share, "but Eleanor's been asking some very pointed questions about your old job. The engineering firm you left 3 years ago." I set the pitcher down slowly. "What kind of questions?" "Whether there'd been any issues," Diane said carefully. "Any problems before you left." She mentioned something about a project that went over budget, some kind of dispute with a client. I didn't think much of it until she asked me twice in one conversation. My stomach tightened, the specific cold recognition of someone poking at a part of your history you thought was closed and settled. 3 years earlier, I had left my previous engineering firm under circumstances that were, in reality, entirely ordinary and entirely explainable, a commercial renovation project where the client had cut corners on materials against my explicit written recommendations, resulting in a structural issue that surfaced 8 months after I'd left the company. I had documented every warning I'd given in writing. I had been, if anything, the one person on that project who'd done everything right. But it had still ended in a lawsuit between the client and the firm, my name mentioned in passing in the discovery documents, and it had been, without question, the most stressful 18 months of my professional life. I hadn't hidden this from Ryan. I'd told him everything, in detail, on our 4th date, because I have never believed relationships built on omission last very long. He'd listened, asked good questions, and told me it sounded like I'd done exactly what any responsible engineer would have done. I trusted that conversation. I hadn't thought, until that moment in his mother's kitchen, that anyone else in his family even knew the story existed. "Has she said anything to Ryan about it?" I asked. Diane shook her head. "Not that I know of. But Eleanor doesn't usually ask questions unless she's planning to use the answers for something." I didn't say anything to Ryan that night. I told myself I was being paranoid, that Diane had probably misread an innocent conversation, that Eleanor was simply the kind of mother who did her due diligence on anyone marrying into the family, and there was nothing sinister in that. I have spent 7 years training myself to trust a careful pattern over a single data point, and I told myself, driving home that night, that one overheard conversation didn't constitute a pattern yet. I was wrong about that. It was, in fact, exactly the beginning of one. 2 weeks later, the pattern confirmed itself in a way I could no longer explain away. I'd stopped by Ryan's office on a Tuesday afternoon to drop off a set of blueprint revisions for a joint project we'd started discussing, a small home renovation for a friend of ours, something we were doing together as a kind of practice run for the life we were building. His assistant, a sharp, quietly observant woman named Renee who'd always liked me more than she probably should have admitted out loud, waved me toward Ryan's office and then, almost as an afterthought, mentioned something that stopped me cold in the hallway. Your future mother-in-law was in earlier, Renee said. Met with Ryan's business partner, Grant, for almost an hour. Didn't see Ryan at all, actually, waited until he'd stepped out for a client call. That's strange, I said carefully. Did she say what it was about? Renee lowered her voice, glancing toward the closed conference room door. I only caught bits. Something about the wedding venue contract. And something about a private investigator. I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me, the particular vertigo of hearing two words together that should never have appeared in the same sentence about your own upcoming wedding. I thanked Renee, told her it was probably nothing, and walked into Ryan's office with a calm I did not remotely feel. I didn't mention what I'd heard to Ryan that day. Some instinct, the same one that had kept me quiet with Diane 2 weeks earlier, told me this wasn't the moment to raise it, not because I didn't trust him, but because I didn't yet have enough pieces to understand what I was even accusing his mother of. 7 years of engineering work had taught me that pointing at a single crack before you understand what's causing it usually gets you dismissed as paranoid, not taken seriously. I needed more before I said anything out loud. That evening, I did something I'm not entirely proud of, though I don't regret it either. I called Grant directly, Ryan's business partner and a man I'd always gotten along with easily at dinners and holiday parties, under the pretense of asking about scheduling for the renovation project we were working on. Near the end of the call, almost offhand, I mentioned that I'd heard Eleanor had stopped by the office. There was a pause on the line just half a second too long. She did, Grant said carefully. Just some questions about the venue contract. Nothing major. What kind of questions? Another pause. Grace, I'd rather Ryan talk to you about this directly, if it comes up. It's not really my place. That single sentence told me more than a full explanation would have. Grant was not a man who avoided conversations easily, he was direct, almost bluntly so, in every interaction I'd had with him. If he was choosing his words that carefully now, it meant whatever Eleanor had asked him wasn't a passing curiosity. It was strategy. And strategy, in my experience, always has a target. I hung up the phone and sat quietly in my apartment for a long time that night, running through everything I knew so far the way I would run through a structural report, the cracks in isolation, the load patterns, the small inconsistencies that only mean something once you start connecting them. Eleanor had been asking about my old job. Eleanor had met privately with Ryan's business partner about the venue contract. Eleanor had, at some point, apparently mentioned a private investigator. I didn't yet know what she was building. But I knew, with the same cold certainty I feel walking into a building with a compromised foundation, that whatever it was going to come down on somebody's head eventually. I just didn't yet understand how carefully she'd built it to land specifically on mine. If you've ever had that particular feeling, watching pieces of something quietly assemble around you before you fully understand what it is, you already know how unsettling that slow-building dread can be. That's exactly the kind of moment we tell stories about here on Calm Stories Time, so if you haven't already hit subscribe, now's a good time, because what Eleanor was actually planning was far worse than anything I'd let myself imagine. The full shape of it came into focus 10 days later, and it arrived, fittingly, through the exact kind of paperwork I'd spent my career learning to read carefully. I'd offered to help Ryan go through some of his late father's old estate documents. His father, Charles Sinclair, had passed away 6 years earlier, and the family foundation Eleanor ran had been established using a portion of his estate. Ryan had mentioned, almost in passing over dinner one night, that he'd never actually seen the full trust documentation himself, that Eleanor had always handled the business side of things, and he'd simply signed whatever was placed in front of him at the appropriate times, trusting his mother the way children raised with money often learn to trust the adults who manage it for them. We sat together at his kitchen table on a Thursday evening, a banker's box of old files between us, sorting through a decade of paperwork that had clearly never been organized with any real system. Somewhere near the bottom of the box, beneath a stack of old tax filings, I found a folder labeled simply Pierce Trust Adjustment, 2021, and something in the label made me pause the way an unfamiliar sound in a building makes you pause before you can even articulate why. Inside were amendment documents to the Family Foundation's charter, dated 3 years earlier, restructuring a portion of the trust's charitable disbursements to flow through a secondary account before eventually reaching Vanessa Pierce's family foundation, the same Vanessa Pierce whose family Eleanor had spent a decade hoping Ryan would marry into. Attached was a handwritten note in Eleanor's unmistakable, precise cursive, contingent on ours engagement proceeding as discussed. Revisit if circumstances change. I read that line 3 times before I fully understood what I was looking at. Eleanor hadn't simply hoped Ryan would end up with Vanessa Pierce. She had structured actual financial arrangements, money belonging, at least in part, to Ryan's late father's estate, around the assumption that he would. And now that assumption had collapsed the moment he'd proposed to me instead. My hands went cold holding that folder. I have spent 7 years of my career finding exactly this kind of quiet, buried inconsistency in other people's paperwork, the small clause nobody thinks to question until it's too late. I had never expected to find one buried in my own future mother-in-law's estate files, tucked behind old tax returns in a box I'd volunteered to help sort through out of nothing more than wanting to be useful. I didn't say anything to Ryan that night. He was sitting 3 feet away from me, sorting through his father's old correspondence with the particular tenderness of a son who still missed him, and some careful part of me understood that this wasn't a conversation to have in the middle of that. I photographed the pages quietly on my phone while he was in the kitchen refilling our coffee, slid the folder back into the box exactly where I'd found it, and sat with the weight of what I now understood the rest of that evening, saying nothing. Because now I understood what Eleanor was actually doing. This was never really about my old job, or a lawsuit that had nothing to do with me, or a private investigator digging through my history. Those were just tools. What Eleanor was actually protecting was money tied to an arrangement she'd made contingent on her son marrying someone else entirely, an arrangement that would collapse, publicly and expensively, the moment our wedding actually happened. She wasn't trying to stop the wedding because she thought I was wrong for her son. She was trying to stop the wedding because it was going to cost her something real. 5 days before the wedding, the campaign Eleanor had been quietly building finally surfaced into open air, and it arrived exactly the way I should have expected, not aimed directly at me, but circulated carefully among the people whose opinions mattered most. I found out from my own mother, of all people, who called me in a state of controlled panic on a Tuesday afternoon. "Grace, I just got the strangest call from a woman named Carol, says she's an old friend of Eleanor's, apparently helping with wedding logistics. She asked me, very politely, whether I was aware of some financial irregularities from your old job. Said she just wanted to make sure the family understood the full picture before the wedding." I sat down slowly on the edge of my bed, the specific dizziness of watching a carefully constructed lie reach all the way back to my own mother, a woman who had worked double shifts her entire life to make sure I never had to explain myself to anyone. "Mom, there's nothing to that story. I left that firm because a client ignored my recommendations, not because I did anything wrong." "I know that, sweetheart," she said, and I could hear in her voice the particular fury of a mother whose child has just been quietly attacked by someone wearing a smile. But she wasn't calling to ask me. She was calling to tell me. There's a difference. Over the following 2 days, the picture assembled itself fully. Eleanor had, through a small network of family friends and foundation board members, quietly circulated a version of my old lawsuit story reshaped just enough to sound damning, that I had been personally responsible for a construction failure that endangered lives, that I had left my old firm under something close to a cloud, that the family, out of concern for Ryan's reputation and the foundation's public image, felt obligated to revisit the wedding plans before it was too late. Nothing she said was technically a lie. It was simply arranged, carefully, to produce an impression that was entirely false. Aunt Diane called me the night before the rehearsal dinner, her voice tight with something between guilt and urgency. "Grace, I think you need to know, Eleanor's planning to raise this at the rehearsal dinner tomorrow. In front of everyone. She's telling people she's going to pause the wedding until things are properly looked into." I sat with that information for a long time that night, alone in my apartment, running through every option available to me the way I'd run through structural failure scenarios 100 times before in my career, which support beam to reinforce first, which crack to address before it spreads. I could confront Eleanor privately before the dinner, though something told me she'd simply deny everything and adjust her strategy in real time. I could tell Ryan everything I'd found, though some careful part of me worried he might not believe the full extent of it without proof in his hands. Or I could do what I'd spent 7 years training myself to do in exactly this kind of situation: gather every piece of evidence quietly, say nothing prematurely, and wait for the moment when the truth would land with the most weight and the least room for anyone to argue their way around it. I chose the third option. That night, I photographed every page of the Pierce Trust folder again at higher resolution, printed clean copies, and placed them in a sealed envelope. I didn't yet know exactly how I was going to use it. I only knew, with the same certainty I feel standing in front of a compromised foundation, that whatever Eleanor was planning to do at that rehearsal dinner, I needed to be the one holding the actual blueprint of what was really going on. If you've ever watched someone you love's family quietly build a case against you using nothing but half-truths and careful timing, you already know how disorienting that particular kind of dread feels, the sense that the fight is happening entirely out of your sight until it isn't. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had to gather your own quiet proof before someone else's lie could take hold, and subscribe to Calm Stories Time if you want more stories where the truth eventually gets its moment, because tomorrow night, it finally did. The rehearsal dinner was held in the private dining room of a restaurant Ryan and I had chosen together months earlier, 40 guests seated around a long table beneath warm hanging lights, the kind of room built for toasts and easy laughter the night before a wedding. I arrived already knowing, with total certainty, that this evening was not going to go the way anyone in that room besides Eleanor and me was expecting. Dinner proceeded normally enough through the first course: polite conversation, a toast from Ryan's uncle, my own mother sitting close beside me with a protective tension in her shoulders that told me she hadn't forgotten Carol's phone call from 3 days earlier. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, composed and gracious in the particular way she always was in public, refilling wine glasses and smiling at guests with the practiced warmth of a woman who had spent decades mastering exactly how a room should feel around her. She waited until dessert had been served before she made her move, and I understood immediately, watching her set down her own fork with deliberate precision, that she'd chosen this exact moment for a reason: late enough that the wine had loosened everyone's guard, early enough that there would still be time for the evening to unravel completely before anyone could leave. Before we finished the evening, Eleanor said, her voice carrying easily across the table without needing to be raised, "I think there's something the family deserves to discuss honestly, out of respect for everyone gathered here tonight." She let her eyes settle on me, gentle and devastating at once. "I've learned some things recently about Grace's professional history that concern me deeply: a serious construction failure, a lawsuit, circumstances she left out of a firm under. I don't say this to embarrass anyone. I say it because I think, before tomorrow, this family deserves the full picture." The table went silent in that specific way a room goes quiet when everyone already senses which direction the next few minutes are about to travel. My mother's hand found mine under the table and gripped it hard. "There's been a misunderstanding," I said, keeping my voice level. "I can explain exactly what happened with that project, if anyone actually wants to hear it." "I'm sure you can," Eleanor said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "But I think, given the seriousness of it, it might be wisest to pause the wedding until we've had time to properly understand the situation. I've already spoken to the venue about flexibility on the date." Gasps moved quietly around the table. Somewhere near the far end, I saw Vanessa Pierce, invited, I now understood with sudden clarity, specifically for this exact moment, glance toward Eleanor with an expression that looked almost like relief. And that's when Ryan stood up. He hadn't said a word through the entire exchange, sitting with the stillness I'd learned, over 3 years, meant he was processing something far more carefully than his silence suggested. He rose slowly from his chair, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out the same manila envelope I had quietly slipped into his hands 20 minutes before dinner began, an envelope I'd finally decided, standing outside the restaurant that evening, he deserved to open himself, in front of the very room his mother had chosen for her ambush. "Mom," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge none of us had ever heard from him before you cancel my wedding in front of 40 people, I think you need to open this." Eleanor's composure held for exactly as long as it took her to slide the first page out of the envelope, and I watched it crack in real time, the particular unraveling of a woman who has spent her entire life being the one holding every card, suddenly realizing the deck had been rearranged behind her back. "What is this?" she asked, though her voice had already lost its earlier certainty. "You know exactly what that is," Ryan said. "That's the Pierce Trust Adjustment File. The one restructuring Dad's estate disbursements through a secondary account, contingent on my engagement proceeding as discussed." "Your handwriting, Mom. Your note. Dated 3 years ago, back when you'd already decided I was going to end up with Vanessa whether I agreed to it or not." The table had gone completely, utterly silent. Vanessa Pierce's face had drained of color. Whatever she'd known or hadn't known about her own family's arrangement with Eleanor, it was clear from her expression that this particular detail was landing on her for the first time too. "Ryan, I can explain the context of that document," Eleanor said, her voice tightening. "You can," Ryan said, "and I'd genuinely like to hear it, after tonight. But right now, what I need everyone at this table to understand is that you didn't fly a private investigator into Grace's old job history because you were worried about this family's reputation. You did it because Grace marrying me broke an arrangement you built years ago without ever telling me it existed. This was never about her past. It was about money you'd already promised somewhere else." My father-in-law's older sister, seated near the middle of the table, set down her wine glass with a sharp, deliberate click. "Eleanor, is that true?" Eleanor didn't answer immediately, and in the specific silence of a woman who has never once had to answer for herself in front of a room like this, I saw something in her finally break loose from its careful, decades-old casing. "I was protecting this family's future," she said, her voice rising now, all pretense of gentle concern gone. "Charles would have wanted the foundation's assets protected. Vanessa's family understood the responsibilities that come with this kind of legacy. I never said anything untrue about Grace's job. Every fact I mentioned was accurate." "Every fact you mentioned was accurate," Ryan repeated, "and arranged specifically to make an innocent woman look guilty of something she wasn't. That's not honesty, Mom. That's a version of honesty you built like a weapon." I hadn't said a single word through this entire exchange, and I didn't feel the need to. I'd spent 7 years learning that the strongest structural argument doesn't need to be shouted, it simply needs to be sound enough that nobody in the room can argue their way around it once it's fully laid out. Ryan had laid it out completely, and there was nothing left in that room for anyone to hide behind. My mother reached over and squeezed my hand once, hard, the particular squeeze of a woman who has spent her whole life protecting her daughter and is finally watching someone else do it for her. Aunt Diane was crying quietly near the end of the table. And Vanessa Pierce, to her credit, stood up from her seat, said something quiet and apologetic to Ryan that I didn't fully catch, and left the restaurant entirely before dessert plates had even been cleared. Eleanor remained seated at the head of the table, the room around her having entirely reorganized itself against her for what I suspected was the first time in her adult life, and for one long moment, she looked less like the composed, immovable woman who had spent months quietly building a case against me, and more like exactly what she was, someone whose careful architecture had finally been read correctly by the one person she'd never expected to look that closely. If you've ever watched someone's carefully built story collapse the moment the real evidence finally reached the light, you already know exactly how satisfying and how sad that particular silence can feel all at once. That's exactly the kind of moment we tell stories about here on Com Stories Time, so if you haven't already, go ahead and hit subscribe, because what happened the next morning mattered even more than what happened at that table. I didn't sleep much that night, running through the evening the way I run through a finished inspection report, checking every joint, every load point, making sure nothing I'd seen had been a misread. Ryan stayed at my apartment instead of his own that night, something we hadn't planned but neither of us questioned, and somewhere around 2 in the morning, sitting together on my couch with the lights still on, he finally said the thing I think he'd been carrying quietly for weeks. "I've suspected something was off for almost a month," he admitted. "Grant mentioned my mother had asked some strange questions about the venue contract, and when I asked her about it directly, she brushed it off completely. I didn't have proof of anything, so I didn't want to accuse her of something I couldn't back up. I just started paying closer attention. He looked at me carefully. When did you find the trust file? 10 days ago, I said. I didn't want to bring it to you without being completely sure what it meant first. He nodded slowly, understanding exactly why I'd waited, the same instinct that had kept him quiet about his own suspicions until he had something solid to stand on. I'm sorry it took an envelope on a dinner table for both of us to finally say it out loud. The next morning, Eleanor called Ryan's phone 4 times before he finally answered, and from what he told me afterward, the conversation was short and, for the first time in his life, entirely on his terms. She didn't apologize, not really. She offered instead a careful, lawyerly explanation about protecting the foundation's obligations and difficult decisions made with the family's long-term interests in mind, language I recognized instantly as the sound of someone trying to rebuild a version of events that could survive scrutiny. Ryan listened to all of it, and then told her, calmly and without raising his voice, that the wedding was proceeding exactly as planned, and that if she wanted any place in his life going forward, it would need to start with an honest accounting of what she'd actually done, not to me, but to him, the son whose future she'd quietly mortgaged years before he'd even had a say in it. She didn't come to the wedding 2 days later. I won't pretend that didn't leave a mark on Ryan, a small, complicated grief sitting alongside everything else he was feeling that week, the particular sorrow of a son realizing his mother had chosen an arrangement over him and then chosen her own pride over repairing it. But he didn't let it swallow the day. He stood at the end of that garden aisle we'd first walked through laughing together, and when I reached him, he took both my hands and said, quietly, just for me, I should have trusted my own instincts about her sooner. I'm sorry it took this long for me to actually see it clearly. I didn't need the apology by then. I'd already gotten the thing that mattered most, watching him choose, in the one moment that counted more than any other, to stand entirely on my side of the room instead of staying carefully positioned between us the way he might have a year earlier. We were married that afternoon under string lights and early summer air, 40 fewer guests than originally planned, and not one of them missed. My mother cried through the entire ceremony. Aunt Diane, seated in the second row, squeezed my hand tightly when I walked past her afterward and whispered, I'm glad it was you who found that folder, and not someone who would have used it differently. She was right, in a way I've thought about often since. I could have used what I found to embarrass Eleanor publicly, to destroy her reputation the way she'd tried to quietly destroy mine. I chose instead to hand it to the one person who deserved to see it most clearly, and let him decide what to do with the truth once it was finally in his hands. Some things, I've learned over 7 years of finding cracks other people miss, aren't about winning the argument as loudly as possible. They're about making sure the right person finally gets to see the whole structure clearly, and trusting them to do something honest with what they find. Eleanor reached out to Ryan 4 months later, a quiet, careful letter rather than a phone call, asking for a conversation with no conditions attached. They've spoken twice since, slowly, cautiously, the way you rebuild something that's had its foundation genuinely tested rather than simply neglected. I wasn't part of those conversations, and I didn't ask to be. Some repairs, I've come to understand, need to happen between exactly the two people who broke and are trying to fix them, without anyone else standing nearby measuring the progress. As for me, I think about that rehearsal dinner often, not with anger anymore, mostly with a kind of quiet gratitude for the version of Ryan that finally stood up in front of that room. Love, I've come to believe, isn't only tested in the easy seasons, the ones full of gardens and string lights and dinners that go exactly the way you planned them. Sometimes it's tested in exactly the moment someone has to choose, in front of everyone who matters most to them, which room they're actually going to stand in. If this story meant something to you, that's exactly the kind of story we tell every week here on Calm Stories Time, so if you haven't already, go ahead and hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments, has someone ever surprised you by finally standing up for you at exactly the moment it counted most?